Hi, I'm Ben Talsma from the Van Andel Education Institute, and I'm here with Dr. Jeannee Yermakoff, a toxicologist with lots of experience. And she's here to talk with us about genetically modified organisms and about how to know whether the science that you're reading is good science. So, Dr. Yermakoff, could you tell us a little bit about your background?
My background is in chemistry and pharmacology and toxicology. My first job was at the National Academy of Sciences, which gave me a good exposure to looking at science with a really careful eye. And I ended my career retiring from British Petroleum, working to make sure that the chemicals used were safe for everybody.
Outstanding. So today we'd like to talk about genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. And the big question we want to know is, are GMOs safe? What's your opinion?
My thought is that GMOs are safe to consume. We have lots of history to help support that. GMOs have been in our grocery stores for nearly 2 decades. So for many of the young people listening to this video, that's more than twice your lifetime. And we have not seen any adverse effects during that period of time. Now, that's relatively anecdotal. There's a more scientific way to analyze the safety, and I think we'll talk about that as we go forward.
So when we talk about the track record of GMOs, if GMOs were dangerous, what sort of things would we expect to see?
Well, some of the allegations are that GMOs have caused an increase in, or potentially could cause an increase in cancer. But the evidence to support that is in fact at best extremely weak and perhaps non-existent.
So if genetically modified organisms caused cancer, we would expect to see a significant increase in the rate of cancer over the last 20 years.
Yes, and one of the ways that we might see some evidence of that is that in North America, GMOs have been in our supermarkets and we have been consuming them for nearly 20 years, as I said. But in Europe, there has been resistance to the use of GMOs. And so really for the past 20 years, there's been very little exposure to GMOs in that environment. So if in fact GMOs were a big, horrible monster causing serious health effects, certainly we have a very large laboratory to study when you can compare essentially 2 continents for 20 years.
And are the cancer rates, various types of cancers, different types of cancers, similar in those 2 environments?
Yes, they are.
Interesting. And you talked about a more scientific, you talked about a more laboratory-based approach to determining whether or not GMOs were safe. Could you talk about that a little?
Yes. If somebody asked me to go look at the evidence for safety for GMOs and put together a summary of that evidence and how strong it was, my first thing would be to go through as many scientific sources as I could, and I would keep a number of things in mind when I did that search. One is I would try and keep an open mind is the first thing, and the example I always use is Galileo, who was punished for most of his life for having a viewpoint that the earth revolved around the sun and not the other way around. He was essentially imprisoned for most of his life for having that viewpoint, which turned out to be correct. But the conventional wisdom during his lifetime was that that was misinformation and there were people who didn't want to hear that answer. So it's really important to keep an open mind and not be influenced by conventional wisdom. So that's the first thing. And part of it, if you go back to that example of Galileo, gets to the second point, which is one of the reasons Galileo was punished was there were people in certain organizations that did not want to accept that that was true. And so you have to look at the motives for people making statements about science, are they making that scientific statement because they really want to disseminate what they think is the best information, or are they making that statement because they have a case to be made that they have some personal interest in?
So are they really spreading this science because they want to discover the truth, or because they have some other motive?
Correct.
Interesting. So in general, when you read a scientific article, or you're looking in the newspaper and you read about science, what are some things that you can do at home to make sure that the science that you're reading is good science that wants to spread the truth?
You look at the source and say, is this an objective source of information? If somebody is selling chemical ABC because they say it makes you healthier and they're making a profit off chemical ABC, then they probably aren't objective about whether or not that chemical ABC is safe for you or not. But a scientist who evaluated that chemical independently, or the government who was asked to take a position on the safety of that chemical, would probably be giving you objective information.
Is there anything else that we can do to help determine whether or not the science that we're reading is good science?
Yes, we certainly can. One is to look at not just one isolated piece of scientific evidence, but to look at a broad spectrum of evidence. In other words, don't just look at one study, look at 10 studies and see how they compare. And if 9 out of those 10 studies tell you one thing, and one of those studies tells you another, there's a pretty good chance that the 9 is the correct way to look.
So there are lots of good scientists who are motivated by a desire to find out what's true about the world.
Exactly.
And if we look at a lot of those scientists' studies and see what most of them are saying, then we can be fairly confident that what we're hearing and what we're believing is the best information that we have right now.
Exactly. Because if you compare what most of those scientists are saying, and they can reproduce each other's work, that gives you a strong confidence that that information is correct. And let's go back to those 9 out of 10 studies. It could be that the 1 out of 10 that gave you different information was a very well-intentioned scientist, but just had a bad process for doing that research and didn't realize that they made some mistakes in coming to those conclusions. So, but if you look at that study in detail from a scientific perspective, you might be able to find those mistakes.
So part of what students are learning is how to go through the process of thinking like a scientist.
Mm-hmm.
So they could read some of those studies and see if they can identify any problems with the science that was being done.
Exactly.
Outstanding. Anything else that you'd like to share about how to know whether the science we're reading is good science?
You know, as children, when you were growing up, you probably asked, speaking to the people listening to this video, you probably asked the question why quite often. I think if you have the opportunity to speak to any scientist personally, or somebody who's taking a scientific position, the question why are you telling me that, is always a good place to start. And that answer should include the breadth of information that person looked at, the source of information, the quality of information. And if you're asking about a specific study, that person should be able to tell you how that study was conducted and why it was good.
Outstanding. Well, thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate that. And I hope that all of you learned something interesting about GMOs and about how to tell whether the science you're reading is good science.